The German corporal couldn't believe what he was reading. Sitting in the processing center at Camp Concordia, Kansas, in the summer of 1943, Hans Müller stared at the paper in his hands. 80 cents per day. For work. The Americans were going to pay him to work while he was their prisoner. He read it again, certain he'd misunderstood the English. Around him, dozens of other newly arrived prisoners whispered amongst themselves, equally bewildered. Back home, the propaganda machine had painted a clear picture of American brutality. They'd been told to expect torture, starvation, forced labor in mines and factories until they dropped dead from exhaustion. Instead, they'd been given clean uniforms, hot meals, and now this, a work contract offering wages. Hans looked up at the American officer standing before them, searching the man's face for cruelty, for the sadistic grin that would reveal this was all some elaborate psychological torture. But the officer just smiled pleasantly and asked if anyone had questions about the canteen prices. The canteen, where they could buy things with their wages. Something fundamental in Hans's understanding of the war had just shattered. To understand why this moment was so shocking, we need to go back to how these men ended up here in the first place. By 1943, the tide of World War II had turned decisively against Germany. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps had suffered devastating defeats. At Stalingrad, an entire German army had been annihilated, and in Italy, Allied forces were pushing northward, capturing thousands of German and Italian soldiers with each advance. The Allies faced an unprecedented problem. What do you do with hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners when you're still fighting a global war? Britain was already overcrowded and under constant threat of bombing. The Soviet Union had a grim solution, one that violated every convention of warfare. But America? America had something its allies desperately lacked. Space. Vast, empty space, thousands of miles from any battlefield. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States would establish over 500 POW camps across the country, eventually housing more than 425,000 prisoners, 371,000 Germans, 50,000 Italians, and about 4,000 Japanese. These camps stretched from the deserts of Arizona to the farmlands of Iowa, from the forests of Wisconsin to the plains of Texas. But the American government faced a challenge beyond just housing these men. The Geneva Convention, signed in 1929, established clear rules for the treatment of prisoners of war, and, unlike their Axis enemies, the Americans intended to follow those rules to the letter. Article 27 of the Convention stated that prisoners could be compelled to work, but not in any capacity that directly aided the war effort. Article 34 specified that prisoners performing work should be paid. The rate? Based on local wages, but not less than what the capturing nation paid its own soldiers for similar work. For America in 1943, that meant 80 cents per day. To the German prisoners, this was incomprehensible. In Nazi Germany, the concept of paying enemy prisoners was laughable. Soviet POWs in German camps were worked to death, receiving starvation rations and no compensation. The idea that warfare could include humane treatment of enemies contradicted everything the Nazi propaganda machine had taught them. Hans Müller had been captured near Tunis in May 1943. He was 24 years old, from a small town near Stuttgart, and had joined the Wehrmacht in 1940, believing he was defending his homeland from encirclement by hostile powers. He'd fought in France, then been shipped to North Africa, where the brutal Desert War had slowly eroded his certainty about German invincibility. The capture itself had been almost anticlimactic. His unit, cut off and surrounded, had run out of water and ammunition. They'd surrendered to American troops who'd seemed almost embarrassed by how easy it was. No dramatic last stand, no glorious death for the fatherland. just thirst, exhaustion, and the recognition that continuing to fight was suicide. The Americans had given them water immediately, not as a reward or even as an act of mercy that required gratitude, just as a matter of course, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Then, food. Real food, not the barely edible rations they'd been subsisting on for weeks. Hans had expected the cruelty to come later. Surely, once they were away from the front lines, once there were no witnesses, the Americans would reveal their true nature. Instead, they'd been loaded onto ships and transported across the Atlantic. The journey took 2 weeks, and while the conditions were cramped, they were no worse than the troop transports Hans had experienced in the Wehrmacht. They were fed twice daily. No one beat them. No one even seemed particularly angry at them. Landing in Norfolk, Virginia, had been surreal. America, the enemy homeland. Hans had expected bombed-out cities, a population crushed by war, perhaps even crowds of angry civilians throwing stones. Instead, he saw a bustling port city, intact buildings, people going about their business as if there weren't a war on at all. The train journey west took 3 days. Hans pressed his face against the window, staring at the endless American landscape rolling past. Fields of wheat stretching to the horizon, small towns with neat houses and automobiles parked on quiet streets, factories humming with production, no bomb craters, no rubble, no signs of deprivation whatsoever. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. How could Germany be winning the war if America looked like this? Camp Concordia sprawled across 640 acres of Kansas prairie. It could house up to 4,000 prisoners in tidy rows of barracks surrounded by double fences and guard towers. But, unlike the concentration camps Hans had heard whispers about back in Germany, this place looked almost civilized. Each barrack was wooden, raised off the ground, with windows, heating stoves, and electric lighting. The prisoners slept on steel cots with mattresses, sheets, and blankets. There were communal bathrooms with running water and flush toilets. A separate building served as a mess hall, where 3 meals a day were served on actual plates with metal utensils. The camp had a hospital staffed by American doctors and German POW medics. There was a library, a recreation hall, even a small theater where prisoners could put on performances. Hans couldn't reconcile this with anything he'd been told about American savagery. The first morning, he woke to the sound of a bugle calling them to formation. They filed out into the central yard, expecting the brutal discipline of Wehrmacht morning drills. Instead, an American camp commander, speaking through a German interpreter, explained the camp rules in a matter-of-fact tone. No escape attempts. Violators would be punished with solitary confinement. No violence against fellow prisoners or guards. Attendance at morning and evening roll call was mandatory. Everything else was laid out with a strange kind of reasonableness, as if they were being briefed on the rules of a boarding school rather than a prison camp. Then came the work detail assignments. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to be used for labor, and America desperately needed workers. The war had pulled millions of men into military service, creating severe labor shortages across the country, especially in agriculture. The 1943 harvest was at risk. Cotton needed picking. Sugar beets needed harvesting. Orchards needed tending. The solution? Put the POWs to work. But here's where it got strange. The prisoners would be paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip, currency that could be used at the camp canteen. For perspective, that was roughly equivalent to $14 in today's money. Not generous by any means, but for prisoners of war who expected nothing, it was baffling. Hans volunteered for agricultural work. The alternative was sitting in the camp all day, and despite everything, he'd been raised to work. The idleness would drive him mad. 3 times a week, he and 60 other prisoners were loaded onto trucks and driven to nearby farms. American guards accompanied them, but the supervision was surprisingly lax. The guards carried rifles but seemed more interested in smoking cigarettes and chatting with each other than in watching every move the prisoners made. The work was hard, picking cotton under the brutal Kansas sun, harvesting wheat, hauling irrigation equipment, but it wasn't any harder than what Hans had done growing up on his family's small farm. What struck him was how the American farmers treated them. No beatings for working too slowly, no screaming. When the heat became oppressive, the farmers brought out water and allowed rest breaks. They even made small talk through the few prisoners who spoke English, asking about Germany, about their families, treating them like humans. One farmer, a man named Earl Tucker, whose own son was fighting in the Pacific, brought sandwiches from his wife one afternoon. Real sandwiches with meat and cheese, not the thin gruel Hans had expected. Earl handed them out to the prisoners, then sat on the tailgate of his truck and ate his own lunch alongside them. "You boys didn't start this war," Earl said through the interpreter. "Politicians started it. You're just caught up in it, same as my boy." Hans didn't know what to say. The propaganda back home had painted Americans as mongrels, weak and decadent, lacking the martial spirit of the German Volk. But Earl Tucker, with his weathered hands and direct gaze, didn't seem weak. He seemed like Hans's own father, a man who worked hard, loved his family, and wanted the war to be over so his son could come home. The cognitive dissonance kept growing. Life in Camp Concordia settled into a routine that felt increasingly absurd when Hans thought about the war still raging across Europe and the Pacific. Wake at 6 a.m., roll call at 6:30, breakfast at 7 huas, usually eggs, bread, coffee, and often meat. While his family back in Germany struggled with rations, he was eating better as a prisoner than he had as a soldier. Work details departed at 8 a.m. for those assigned to them. Others remained in camp for maintenance duties, cooking, cleaning, laundry, camp construction projects. Everyone worked, but the work was compensated, regulated by the Geneva Convention, and limited to reasonable hours. Lunch was brought to work sites or served in the camp mess hall. Dinner at 6 p.m., followed by free time until lights out at 10 p.m. The free time was perhaps the strangest part. The prisoners organized themselves, forming clubs and committees. There were language classes, some Germans teaching English to fellow prisoners, some learning Spanish from a group of Mexican-American guards. There were art classes, music groups, even a camp newspaper printed on a mimeograph machine the Americans provided. Hans joined the theater group, helping build sets for productions of German classics. The Americans allowed them to perform plays, provided materials, even let some local civilians attend performances. It was surreal, putting on Goethe and Schiller for an audience that included both POWs and the citizens of the nation they'd been fighting. But the most controversial aspect of camp life was the canteen. With their 80 cents per day, accumulated over weeks of work, prisoners could purchase items from the camp store. The selection was limited but included toiletries, stationery, cigarettes, candy bars, soft drinks, and small personal items. Hans will never forget the first time he bought a Coca-Cola. This American icon, this symbol of the decadent culture he'd been taught to despise, was now available to him for a nickel. He stood outside the canteen, holding the cold bottle, staring at the distinctive cursive logo. Then he drank it. It was delicious. He felt like a traitor, but he also felt like he'd been lied to about everything. Not every prisoner adjusted well. Some remained committed Nazis, organizing cells within the camps to enforce ideological purity and intimidate those who showed signs of becoming Americanized. These hardliners harassed prisoners who were too friendly with guards, who spoke positively about American treatment, or who questioned Nazi ideology. There were incidents. Prisoners suspected of being anti-Nazi were beaten. In some camps, these beatings turned fatal. The most notorious case occurred at Camp Concordia in Oklahoma, where a German prisoner named Johannes Kunze was beaten to death by fellow POWs for suspected collaboration. 5 prisoners were eventually convicted and executed for the murder. The Americans responded by separating the hardcore Nazis into special camps, isolating them from the general POW population. They also began a re-education program, teaching democratic principles and showing documentary evidence of Nazi atrocities that many prisoners had never seen or had dismissed as propaganda. For Hans, the re-education program was devastating. He'd known the war was brutal. He'd seen combat, seen men die, seen the casual cruelty that warfare breeds, but he'd believed, or wanted to believe, that Germany fought with honor, that the Wehrmacht was separate from the SS, that the stories about camps and mass killings were Allied exaggerations. Then, the Americans showed films from liberated concentration camps. The images were unbearable. Mountains of skeletal corpses, survivors who looked like walking skeletons, gas chambers, crematoria, industrial-scale murder. Some prisoners in the audience screamed that it was fake, that the Americans had staged it all to break their spirit. But Hans recognized the German efficiency in those camps, the same bureaucratic thoroughness that characterized everything the Reich did. This wasn't staged. This was real. He thought of his government, his country, the officers he'd saluted, the cause he'd fought for. He went back to his barrack and didn't speak for 2 days. As the months turned into years, Camp Concordia and the hundreds of other POW camps across America fell into patterns that would have seemed impossible in 1939. The prisoners continued working. The farms near the camps became dependent on POW labor. Some farmers requested the same prisoners each season, developing relationships with them. There were stories of farmers inviting prisoners to dinner at their homes, of American families exchanging letters with German families once the war ended. The 80 cents per day accumulated. Prisoners saved their scrip, purchasing small luxuries that made confinement bearable. Some sent their earnings home through the Red Cross, though the amounts were so small that they rarely made the journey. Others simply hoarded the camp currency, unsure what else to do with it. Hans saved enough to buy art supplies. He'd always loved drawing, and the camp allowed prisoners to pursue hobbies. He sketched the Kansas landscape, the barracks, portraits of fellow prisoners. One American guard, a young man from Ohio named Private Miller, asked Hans to draw his portrait to send home to his girlfriend. Hans obliged, and Miller paid him with real American cigarettes, which Hans traded for more art supplies. The absurdity was complete. A German prisoner of war, working as an artist for American guards, paid in cigarettes, living in comfortable conditions while the war ground on. Sports became a major part of camp life. The prisoners organized soccer leagues, with different barracks fielding teams. The Americans provided equipment and designated fields. Guards would sometimes watch the matches, cheering for their favorite teams. The competition was fierce. These were men who needed outlets for energy and aggression, but it was channeled into sport rather than conflict. There were escape attempts, though they were half-hearted and almost inevitably ended in recapture. Where would they go? They were in the middle of Kansas, thousands of miles from any German territory. They didn't speak English well enough to blend in. They had no money, no contacts, no real plan beyond a vague notion of returning to the fight. Most escapees were caught within days, usually by local farmers or police. The punishment? Solitary confinement for a few weeks, then back to the general population. No torture, no execution, just time alone to think about how pointless escape was. One prisoner made it all the way to Chicago before being picked up by police. He'd hopped trains, hidden in freight cars, survived on stolen food. When caught, the Americans seemed more impressed by his tenacity than angry at the violation. He spent a month in solitary, then became something of a camp celebrity, regaling others with his adventure. And the war in Europe ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hitler was dead. The Reich had fallen. The prisoners in Camp Concordia learned about VE Day from the American Guards. Some of the hardline Nazis refused to believe it, insisting it was propaganda. But as weeks passed and the evidence became undeniable, a strange mood settled over the camp. Relief, grief, uncertainty. Relief that the killing was over. Grief for what Germany had become and what had been done in its name. Uncertainty about what came next. Hans learned that his hometown of Stuttgart had been heavily bombed. He didn't know if his family had survived. The Red Cross was working to reunite prisoners with information about their families, but the process was agonizingly slow. The prisoners assumed they'd be shipped home immediately, but the reality was more complicated. Germany was in ruins. There was barely enough food to feed the surviving German population. The infrastructure was destroyed. Housing millions of returning POWs was logistically impossible. So they stayed. Weeks became months. The work continued. The 80 cents per day continued. Life in the Kansas prairie camp went on while Europe struggled to rebuild. During this period, the re-education program intensified. The Americans were determined that these prisoners would return to Germany as advocates for democracy rather than seeds for a resurgent Nazi movement. Classes covered democratic governance, free market economics, human rights. Prisoners were encouraged to read newspapers, to discuss and debate ideas, to question authority. For many prisoners, this was the first time in their adult lives they'd been encouraged to think critically rather than to obey. The effect was profound. Hans threw himself into the education program. He read voraciously American newspapers, books on history and philosophy, accounts of the war from Allied perspectives. He attended every lecture, asked questions, challenged his own assumptions. He realized that the 80 cents per day had never been about the money. It was about dignity. It was about maintaining humanity in the midst of inhumanity. It was a statement that even enemies deserved to be treated as human beings with rights and agency. The Geneva Convention hadn't required the Americans to be kind. It required them to be humane, and the Americans had interpreted that obligation generously. They'd provided not just survival, but comfort. Not just confinement, but community. Not just imprisonment, but the opportunity for growth. The repatriation began slowly in 1946. Priority went to prisoners who were sick, elderly, or had families in desperate circumstances. Hans waited, working in the camp, saving his scrip though he wasn't sure why. In September 1946, his turn came. He and several hundred other prisoners were loaded onto trucks, then trains, then ships. The journey back to Germany took weeks, and every mile closer to home intensified his anxiety. What would he find? Was his family alive? Would they understand what he'd experienced? Would they believe him when he described American POW camps? Landing in Bremerhaven, Hans saw a Germany he barely recognized. The cities were rubble. People were gaunt, desperate. The economic situation was catastrophic. Millions were homeless. Food was scarce. The black market was the only functioning economy. After 3 years in Camp Concordia, eating 3 meals a day, sleeping in a heated barrack, earning wages for work, Hans was shocked by the devastation of his homeland. He made his way to Stuttgart, or what remained of it. His family's neighborhood had been bombed, but miraculously, his parents and sister had survived, living in the partially repaired basement of their destroyed home. The reunion was emotional, tearful, overwhelming. They'd assumed he was dead. The last letter they'd received from him had been from North Africa in 1943. They'd heard nothing for 3 years. When Hans told them about his time in America, about the camps, the treatment, the 80 cents per day, they looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "You're saying the Americans treated you well?" his father asked, incredulous. "Better than our own army treated us," Hans replied. His father, who'd served in World War I and had been fed Nazi propaganda for years, couldn't process this. The Americans were supposed to be the enemy, supposed to be cruel and barbaric. How could they have been humane? Hans showed them the drawings he'd made in camp. He showed them the last pay stub from his work detail, proof that the Americans had actually paid him. He described the food, the recreation, the education programs. His family listened in stunned silence. "Then why did we fight them?" his sister finally asked. Hans had no answer that made sense anymore. The story of German POWs in America is one of the strangest chapters of World War II. Over 425,000 enemy soldiers, men who'd fought against American troops, were brought to the United States and treated in accordance with international law, a sharp contrast to how POWs were treated by the Axis powers. The 80 cents per day was more than a wage. It was a philosophical statement about the nature of warfare and human rights. It said that even in the midst of total war, even against an ideology as monstrous as Nazism, individual soldiers could be separated from the regimes they served and treated with dignity. Was the system perfect? No. African American soldiers noted the bitter irony that German POWs in southern states were sometimes treated better than Black American citizens. There were incidents of abuse, though they were relatively rare and usually prosecuted. The camps weren't resorts. They were prisons, and prisoners chafed at confinement no matter how comfortable. But the overall program represented something remarkable. An attempt to wage war humanely, to balance military necessity with moral principle, to remember that soldiers were human beings, not just enemy combatants. Many German POWs who experienced American camps became advocates for democracy after the war. They'd seen firsthand that the American system, while imperfect, was fundamentally different from Nazi totalitarianism. They'd experienced a society that valued individual rights, that paid workers fairly, that allowed dissent and debate. Hans Müller, like thousands of other former POWs, became part of the generation that rebuilt Germany as a democracy. The lessons he learned in Camp Concordia about human rights, about the rule of law, about treating even enemies with dignity, shaped his understanding of what Germany could become. He often thought about Earl Tucker, the Kansas farmer who'd shared sandwiches with enemy prisoners, about Private Miller, who'd asked for a portrait, about the American system that had paid him 80 cents per day to work, maintaining his dignity even in captivity. The money itself had been almost worthless, camp scrip that couldn't be spent outside the wire, that bought only small comforts and luxuries. But what it represented? That was priceless. It represented the idea that human dignity isn't conditional on nationality or ideology, that rights don't evaporate in wartime, that even enemies are entitled to humane treatment. In 1948, Hans used his savings, small amounts he'd managed to earn in the devastated post-war German economy, to buy a plane ticket back to Kansas. He wanted to thank Earl Tucker, to see the farm where he'd worked, to understand America beyond the prison camp. Earl welcomed him with the same straightforward warmth he'd shown during the war. They sat on the same truck tailgate where they'd eaten lunch 4 years earlier, and Earl asked about Hans's family, about Germany's recovery, about his plans for the future. "You know why we treated you boys the way we did?" Earl asked. Hans shook his head. "Because that's how I'd want my son treated if he got captured. Doesn't matter who starts a war or who's right and who's wrong. Prisoners are still somebody's sons. They're still human beings." It was the simplest explanation imaginable, and the most profound. Hans returned to Germany carrying that lesson. He became a teacher, educating a new generation about democracy, human rights, and the importance of treating all people, even enemies, with dignity. Whenever his students asked about his war experiences, he'd tell them about Camp Concordia, about the 80 cents per day, about the American system that had paid enemy prisoners to work, fed them adequately, allowed them to form theater groups and sports leagues, treated them as humans rather than subhumans. "That's when I knew," he'd say, "that we'd been on the wrong side. Not because the Allies were perfect, they weren't, but because they believed in something beyond power and racial supremacy. They believed in human dignity, even for their enemies." The 80 cents per day had been the visible symbol of that belief. A small amount of money, insignificant in practical terms but profound in its implications. It said, "You are still human. You still have value. You still deserve to be treated with basic dignity." In the darkest war in human history, that message, delivered in camp script and paid work, offered a glimpse of what human civilization could be at its best.